Good morning, everyone. I'm Tiffany Vasquez, and I will be presenting on merchandise trade statistics. Today, we'll be focusing mainly on imports and domestic exports for the first month of this year, whilst making comparisons to that same month last year. Before jumping directly into January's trade data, however, we thought it useful to take one last but very brief look at the year 2020 to get an overall snapshot of Belize's merchandise trade for one of the most unprecedented years. Total imports for the year 2020 amounted to $1.6 billion. Imports dropped substantially by 20.2%, or almost $398 million when compared to the year 2019. The categories of mineral fuels and lubricants and commercial free zones declined significantly, falling by 46% and 34% respectively. Other commodity categories also decreased notably, with both machinery and transport equipment and other manufacturers each falling by 20% in the year. Likewise, imports of treated pine lumber and used clothing were considerably smaller in 2020, resulting in a 43% drop in the crude materials category. There were also increases observed in the year, particularly in the categories of beverages and tobacco and chemical products, where the increase in the latter was driven mostly by heightened imports of disinfectants, insecticides, and diagnostic testing kits. Now for domestic exports. Merchandise export earnings for the year 2020 totaled $367.8 million. This was a decrease of 11.1%, or a drop of $46.1 million when compared to exports of 2019. Of Belize's 5 major exports, bananas alone saw increased earnings for the year, growing by 10%, or almost $8 million in the year 2020. Now moving on to the focus of today's presentation. In January of this year, Belize imported goods valuing $131.9 million. This represented a considerable 18% decrease, amounting to a drop of almost $29 million when compared to imports of January of 2020. The categories of mineral fuels and lubricants, machinery and transport equipment, and commercial free zones declined markedly during the month. Expenditures on mineral fuels and lubricants dropped by almost 50%, falling from $22.2 million to $11.6 million, a downturn which was prompted by smaller imports of fuel being purchased at reduced world market prices. Importation of machinery and transport equipment, such as aviation equipment, pumps, and vehicles, dropped by 1/4, or $9.8 million to $28.3 million. Goods meant for the commercial free zones likewise declined by approximately 1/4, down by $6.5 million to $20.4 million, with decreased imports such as clothing and handbags. A couple other categories also saw noteworthy decreases during the month. Imports of manufactured goods and other manufacturers together went down by $5.1 million to almost $29 million. That's a combined 28% decrease, owing to fewer purchases of metal structures, galvanized steel coils, and gold jewelry. Food imports also declined during the month, with the food and live animals category going down by $2.4 million to $14.6 million, as the country bought less lard or shortening, canned meats, and margarine. Now, despite the overall downturn in imports, the categories of beverages and tobacco and designated processing areas both recorded greater imports during the month. The beverages and tobacco category rose by $5 million to $8.1 million, an increase due largely to imports of beer that were for the most part intended for re-export. While imports into the designated processing areas went up by $1.5 million to $3.3 million due to purchases of tissue paper, metal office furniture, and centrifuges. Now let's see how our domestic exports performed at the start of the year. Export earnings for January of this year remained virtually unchanged when compared to exports of January of last year, as total domestic exports amounted to $16.2 million, up a negligible 1.1% or $0.2 million when compared to exports of January 2020. Sugar followed a similar trend, having had no discernible change in export earnings, as sales of this product amounted to $1.3 million in January of this year, an amount equaling sugar earnings from January of last year. What is interesting here to note, however, is that this was despite a relatively notable decrease in exported quantities of sugar, indicating strong world market prices for this commodity at the start of this year. In contrast, animal feed provided the only distinct increase in the month, with earnings from this product growing sharply from a mere $0.4 million to $2 million. Earnings from the country's remaining major exports, on the other hand, all declined during the month, with exports of marine products seeing the most pronounced decrease at $1.7 million, falling from $4.3 million to $2.7 million, owing largely to a drop of exports of lobster tails. Revenues from citrus products went down slightly by $0.5 million to $1.9 million, due mainly to reduced exports of orange concentrate, while earnings from bananas also declined marginally, down from $5.7 million to $5.5 million. Now moving on. In looking at export markets, we observed that due to boosted exports of animal feed, earnings from Central America grew from $0.6 million to $2.7 million, while a slight increase in earnings from the UK and a minor decrease in revenue from the EU were predominantly caused by shifting exports of bananas within the first month of the year. And finally, as the country exported no oranges and commodities made of wood in January of this year, earnings from the US went down by $0.9 million to $2.8 million. Now, just to summarize, for January of this year, imports were valued at $131.9 million, down 18% or almost $29 million when compared to January of 2020. Mineral fuels and lubricants, machinery and transport equipment, and commercial-free zones were noted to be the categories in greatest decline. As it relates to domestic exports, export earnings totaled $16.2 million in January of this year, with only a slight increase over exports of January of last year. This was for the most part reflected amongst the exports themselves, with only animal feed and marine products on the opposite end of the spectrum.